let us welcome to the show one of the founders of Harm Reduction Coalition Aotearoa. It is Wendy Allison. Wendy, good evening, and thank you for joining us.
Kia ora, thank you.
Kia ora. Hey, thanks so much for joining us. Chewy's just going off with his, I think I scared him away. I think that's probably what it was. He was freaking out from the noises. We've got you on today because we want to talk about something that you guys are involved with, where you guys are running. Harm Reduction Coalition Aotearoa. Today is International Harm Reduction Day. You guys have launched Harm Reduction Coalition Aotearoa with an open letter to the government that says, amongst other things, HRCA seeks a new fit-for-purpose drug law for Aotearoa New Zealand rooted in science, experience and evidence to promote harm reduction and project human rights as originally recommended by the New Zealand Law Commission in 2011. Now, we can talk about that. It's taken 13 years and we still haven't seen that yet. But a big part of your letter was the signatories to it. And there is a huge number of signatories, be they supporting organisations or be they people who are supporting the open letter in and around the world. And I think it's 155 doctors. Is that right? 155 doctors?
It's 155 signatories. They're not all
right,
doctors, but...
Okay, gotcha. To want to do this. So I know what Chewy's doing. He's being polite and staying up, but I'll bring him in. I think we can all just start chatting together. It makes it the most sense. Wendy, why don't you tell us about what Harm Reduction Coalition Aotearoa is and why you're launching it today and what you're trying to achieve?
Okay, that's a big question, but in a nutshell, Harm Reduction Coalition Aotearoa brings together all of the people who individually believe that we need drug reform in Aotearoa. This has been brewing for quite a while. As alluded to, the Law Commission recommended in 2011 that the Misuse of Drugs Act be replaced by an act administered by the Ministry of Health, and that sunk like a lead balloon, never to be heard of again. But people have been continuing in the background working on their own projects towards drug reform. And what we have lacked in this country has been a cohesive push from all of these individual people and groups who see this as the most sensible way forward. And so what we've done basically is just pull everybody together under one banner to try and get some real advocacy, some coherent and a collaboration between all of these people who think this should happen and actually get something moving instead of forever being ignored because there aren't enough of us in one place.
You said something interesting there. You said you're getting these groups and people together because they think it's the most valuable way forward. Why is it the most valuable way forward? What's different about how we're doing things now versus the valuable way forward which you guys are, suggesting?
Well, the part in the letter that spoke about science, well-being and evidence, the Misuse of Drugs Act doesn't actually contain any of those things. We have this 50-year-old law that was essentially designed as a tool to marginalize groups that the American government didn't like back in the 1970s. And the UN convinced all the countries to jump on board, and we ended up with drug prohibition. And in the 50 years in which it has been attempting to reduce drug use, it has failed to reduce drug use. Whoever wants to use drugs does use drugs. And it has also failed to reduce harm. In fact, it has developed quite a plethora of harms of its own by, for example, handing control of the drug supply to organised crime and creating violence within neighbourhoods and ruining people's lives and making sure that people who have problematic drug use issues are too scared to speak up about it until they can't hide it anymore. And so there's this whole raft of things that have happened because of prohibition that is actively harming people that we believe don't need to happen. And these things are not rooted in science, they're not rooted in evidence. It's an entirely moral-based law. And we just think that it's time to start doing something about that.
Is harm reduction about just a free-for-all, or is it more about taking it out of the hands of the penal system, the justice system, and putting it in the hands of the medical fraternity?
right in the middle, I would say, in between a free-for-all, which would be, I don't know, laissez-faire capitalism, let's legalize all drugs and just let people do whatever they want, and what we currently have, which is criminalization, imprisonment, control of people's lives, destroying people's lives. And neither of these things will reduce harm effectively. There is actually a very nice graph on the HRCA website that you can look at that demonstrates this spectrum and where the minimum amount of harm happens, and that is in an area called legal regulation. So drugs are legal, but they're still well regulated. The supply is regulated, which is what takes it out of the hands of organized crime and reduces the issues that drug checking organizations like Know Your Stuff exist to address, of lack of quality control in the market and people dying from taking things that they are not what they are supposed to be. But you are also permitting people who, the 85 to 95% of people who use drugs regularly who come to no harm, to continue to do these things and make these choices for themselves without regulating their lives unduly.
Chewy, you want to jump in?
So I guess to answer your question, no, it is definitely not a free-for-all.
Gotcha.
This seems to be sort of lining up with what's been tried and seems to be quite successful in places like Portugal, where they have pivoted around to drug addiction and harm reduction into it being a health and addiction issue rather than a criminality point of view. And from everything that I've read about that, it seems to be quite successful. And here in New Zealand, we've had programs around like here in Dunedin, the first needle exchange. And that was initially put forward as encouraging intravenous drug use, but in fact, it was just stopping people spreading hepatitis and HIV around. This seems to be something really sensible and has a lot of worth to be debated. Do you think this current government is going to see it that way?
It's really difficult to say. It appears that this current government has very little interest in drugs as an issue at all, and the national government has never specifically supported harm reduction initiatives or drug reform in general. They voted against drug checking, which was the most recent harm reduction intervention that was legalized in this country. ACT spoke for it. They supported it. One would assume that a party like ACT that claims to be for minimum government and for freedom of choice would support something like this. However, it's very, very difficult at the moment, as you have probably discussed at length already, to predict what anyone in this government is going to do. But we would have presented this to a Labour government had the Labour government won the election. This is about the time for us as opposed to which government we think we're going to get the most traction with. We're just tired of waiting while people die.
Say, like, hypothetically, there was a political party who aligns themselves with people who are more likely to want harm reduction. Like, if that ever mysterious thing ever happened, unlike the last Labour government, came to you and basically said, what do we want to do? What do we want to legislate? Like, what is actually this world that you're wanting look like in legislation, in society?
Okay, that's a really good question. And you Chewy, you spoke before about what they've done in Portugal. What they did in Portugal was to decriminalise possession and use of small amounts of substances, and they removed the criminal sanctions for people who were caught with those substances. However, they did still allow the government to direct people into health programs to address personal use issues should they find that they needed them. What they failed to do was do anything at all about regulation of the supply, which means that in Portugal, they still need drug checking. They still have problems with organised crime. They still have people coming into contact with the sort of criminal underground in order to access drugs. So while drug harm, and especially from the most dangerous substances like heroin, for example, has reduced significantly in Portugal and everybody is seeing this as a great success, they still have considerable issues around the supply of drugs. So what we would like to see happen in New Zealand is for the supply to be regulated in a very similar evidence-based way, so that supply of drugs, for example, to minors, is obviously never going to be legal. And I have heard that in Aotearoa, it's easier for underage kids to get weed than it is to get alcohol, which suggests that having a regulated supply actually does make it harder for kids to get at stuff. So, and given that most young people start making their first decisions about drugs when they are well underage because they're coming across them at those ages, that would suggest that the prohibitionist approach is not preventing kids from coming into contact with drugs. So what we would like to see is regulation of the supply that allows people to purchase and use certain amounts of substances, that ensures that the supply is clean, for want of a better word, there is quality control, that it is manufactured and sold by people with licenses who know what they're doing, that people have access to harm reduction information when they purchase these substances, and that substances are regulated based on the evidence of the actual risks associated with them, instead of this crazy classification system we currently have where a drug like LSD, which has never killed anybody, is class A, but you can buy a drug like alcohol, which millions of people die globally every year, you can buy over the counter. It just makes no sense, and we would like to see that regulated based on evidence.
There is a couple of questions in the chat, if you're okay with that. One of them is from Jezza for a super chat. Thank you, Jezza. Says, is there somewhere we can see how legislation takes out of the hands of organised crime?
Unfortunately, there is no current situation in the Western world where drugs have been taken out of the hands of organised crime through legalisation, because most countries have gone down the decriminalisation track and they haven't touched the supply side. However, if you would like to read about legal regulation and the approach that could be taken and the way in which that could work, I suggest going and having a look at some of the resources on the HRCA website, because there is information there from people who've been studying this for years and years and years, and comparisons between the different approaches to drugs that and how they have worked and what they have done. But unfortunately, nobody has yet been brave enough to go, you know what, prohibition really doesn't work, so let's do something different.
People want to know as well, just to give them a heads up right now, HRCA.NZ is the website that you're referring to, HRCA.NZ. There's also a comment in there, isn't there, Chewy, from Gary, who says this, don't forget to congratulate and thank Wendy for getting our drug checking services legalised almost single-handed. So from Gary to you, someone who knows of the work you're doing, wanted to make sure that there are people watching who appreciate you and want you to know that.
Oh, that's really sweet. Thank you, Gary. And it really wasn't single-handed. It started off with 4 of us, and by the time the government heard about it, there were about 20 of us, and now there are 800 of us.
Nice.
So yeah, it was a team effort. I was
you've
just the one up the front with the big mouth.
You've released your letter. That's out there now. For people who are watching or who are listening to this, what can they do and where to from today for the Harm Reduction Coalition Aotearoa?
Well, for people who are interested in supporting what we're trying to do, the logical thing is to join us. And that way you will be in on the activities that we're doing. We are intending to become quite active and ensure that we are making our voice heard in the public space. We will be making submissions. We intend to become a group that people come to for information on what harm reduction actually means and how it can be implemented effectively in Aotearoa. The other thing is putting pressure on MPs, because one of the things that we're up against is the inertia of 50 years of marginalisation of drug users, and everybody being convinced that if anybody is allowed to take drugs, then next thing, you know, things are going to go terribly, terribly wrong, and drug users are losers and all that kind of stuff. And demonstrating that this is not actually the case, that drug use is normal and it's drug harm that is not normal, is part of what we need to do. And that requires a groundswell of public support. So if you support us, talk about it.
Chewy, got anything else before we wrap up?
At the risk of being slightly tangential, I guess with the drug checking, are you associated with like know your stuff and that sort of thing, the checking your substances at festivals, that sort of thing? One thing I've always wanted to ask someone about, how has their attitude to that changed?
Well, when we started doing it, we thought we were going to get arrested. We were absolutely certain we were going to get arrested. We had a code sign that we called out when we saw police, and people would duck and dive and make sure that they weren't around. But as time went by, we realized that the police actually knew what we were doing, and they were tacitly, because they weren't allowed to speak publicly, they were tacitly allowing us to get on with it, because they knew that people who came to see us were not going to be seeing them later. And they recognized that what we were doing was actually reducing not only drug harm, but the workload of the police. And ever since we realized that, we've had a very, very good relationship with them. They have let us get on with it, and they have immediately recognized that this fits squarely into the category of safer communities together, which is exactly what they say on the sides of their cars. And it's an opportunity for them to actually do that just by letting us get on with it. And we've actually had police recommend to festivals that Know Your Stuff or another drug checking service be brought in to address some of the issues that they're seeing, because they know it works. And so, you know, the police, I don't think it's the police that are the problem in this situation. It's the law that is putting the police in a position where they have to arrest people.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I thought would happen when these sort of when it picked up, that it would be the front line sort of realizing what was going on, and it's filtering back, and hopefully it gets to people that will realize that's the aim, that you want to reduce harm, you find an excellent tool to get money out of organized crime, and then the flow on effects for that. And if it can just do that and not get caught up with a whole bunch of tough on crime rhetoric, you know, the old attitudes towards drug use. Alcohol's fine, of course, cigarettes fine, everything else very, very bad. You know, hopefully we can make some progress. Oh, good on you.
All right, Wendy, anything to leave us with?
Thanks. Well, I think what Chewy just said is very, very relevant, because most of what people believe about drugs is based in rhetoric. It's based in moral judgment. It is not based in science. It's not based in evidence. And it certainly isn't based in the well-being of citizens. So people who are hearing this notion of legal regulation for the first time and have never heard about harm reduction and having a gut reaction that says, no, we couldn't possibly do that, I would just ask them to sit down and ask themselves, has the prohibition law that we currently have reduced drug harm? Because every problem we have with drugs in this country has happened under prohibition. And that's what I'd like to leave you with.
Excellent. Wendy Allison from the Harm Reduction Coalition Aotearoa, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Appreciate your time.